They were still laughing when I sat back down. I remember the exact sound of it. Not the loud, sharp kind of laugh that fills a room. This was the quiet kind. The kind that travels between shoulders leaning close together. The kind shared over wine glasses tilted just enough to hide a smirk. My mother-in-law, to-be, Diane, had her hand pressed flat against her chest like she was trying to hold in something delicious. Her son, my fiancé Marcus, had his eyes down on his plate, but the corners of his mouth were lifted. He thought I didn't see. I saw everything. My mother Gloria was sitting 3 chairs away from me at that long dinner table. She had worn her best dress, the navy one she bought 2 years ago for my cousin's graduation, the one she'd had dry cleaned specifically for tonight. She had done her hair herself that morning. I knew because she called me while she was doing it, nervous, asking if she should wear it up or down. I told her down. She looked beautiful. She was still looking down at her soup when the laughter faded. She didn't look up. She just stirred. That was the moment I made my decision. Not at the restaurant. Not during the dessert course when Diane made another comment, softer that time, almost gentle, about how quaint it must be to have grown up the way my mother had. Not in the car ride home when Marcus said I was being too sensitive and that his mother was just like that I'd understand once I got to know her better. Not even later that night when I sat on the edge of the bathtub in our apartment and pressed my hands against my knees to stop them from shaking. I had already decided. Long before any of that. Let me go back. I met Marcus at a conference in Chicago 3 years ago. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming effortlessly, like they've never once had to work for a room. He had his father's company behind him, which he mentioned within the first 20 minutes, and a smile that made you feel like the most interesting person in the building. I was 29. I had just been promoted. I was, I think, exactly the kind of person who was ready to believe in something like him. We dated for a year before he proposed. It was a good year. He was attentive and funny, and he remembered the small things, the way I take my coffee, the name of my college roommate, the anniversary of the day my father passed. He showed up. For a long time, I thought that was enough. The first time I met his mother, Diane, we had brunch at a restaurant she chose, in a neighborhood I had never been to, at a table she had reserved under her own name. She was polished and precise, and she looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you're not sure will fit the room. She asked where I was from originally. She asked about my mother's work. She asked what part of town my mother lived in. She smiled at every answer. It wasn't until the drive home that I understood the smiling was not warmth. It was a filing system. She was categorizing. Marcus said I was imagining things. He always said that. I want to be honest about something. I am not a person who acts on instinct alone. I am methodical. I make lists. I keep records. I have a folder on my laptop simply titled Notes that I have been adding to for 2 years, and it contains dates, times, exact quotes, and in some cases, screenshots. My therapist once told me that I have an unusual ability to observe a situation clearly even when I am emotionally inside it. I think she meant it as a compliment. I'm still not sure. What I'm saying is that when things began to shift with Marcus, I did not spiral. I paid attention. I noticed the way he handled his mother's calls stepping into the other room, voice lowered. I noticed that after those calls there was always something small. A comment about my apartment, which I owned. A suggestion that maybe I was too focused on work. A question, once, about whether my mother would ever consider moving somewhere with a lower cost of living, phrased as concern, wrapped in softness, landed like something else entirely. I noticed the email I was not supposed to see, which I saw because he left his laptop open on our kitchen counter, and I was walking past, and the subject line contained my name. I didn't read the whole thing. I didn't have to. What I read was enough. I need to tell you about my mother before I go any further, because this story doesn't make sense without her. Gloria raised me alone from the time I was 7 years old. She worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood days at the hospital as a medical billing coordinator, evenings at a tutoring center 2 miles from our apartment. She never complained. I don't mean that in the way people usually mean it, as a figure of speech. I mean, I genuinely cannot remember a single instance of my mother sitting down and saying, "This is hard," or "I am tired," or "This is not what I imagined for myself." She saved that for her prayers, which I could sometimes hear through the wall late at night, quiet and steady like a conversation she had been having her whole life. She put me through college. She was sitting in the front row at my graduation, with a sign she had made herself, purple glitter letters, slightly uneven, the most embarrassing and wonderful thing I have ever seen. She is the reason I know what integrity looks like. She is the reason I know how to be still when everything around me is loud. She does not have a degree. She does not own a company. She has never traveled to Europe or worn designer shoes, or eaten at a restaurant with a tasting menu. She is the most dignified person I have ever met. When Diane called her quaint, she was stirring her soup and looking down, and I watched her decide not to react. I watched her protect me from a scene. I watched her absorb it quietly, the way she has absorbed everything quietly for 30 years. I decided right there that it would be the last time. Marcus and I were engaged for 8 months before the dinner party. That's what Diane called it, a dinner party. In practice, it was an audition. 40 guests, all from their side, at the family estate in Connecticut. His parents wanted to formally introduce me before the wedding, which was scheduled for the following spring. His mother had been planning the event for weeks. She had a seating chart. She had a florist. She had a photographer she was paying to document what she described in a group text as a beautiful evening with family and friends. I was included in that group text. My mother was not. I found out about the seating chart 3 days before the dinner. Marcus mentioned it casually. The way he mentioned things he hoped I wouldn't examine too closely. My mother had been placed at a table near the back of the room. Not a side table, not an oversight, a deliberate placement, separated from the main family tables by 2 full rows of guests, positioned closest to the kitchen door. I asked Marcus about it that night. He said his mother thought it would be more comfortable for her, less overwhelming. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, comfortable for whom? He said I was doing it again, looking for problems, manufacturing conflict, making his mother into something she wasn't. He said I needed to trust that his family had good intentions. He said this with the particular confidence of someone who has never had to question whether a room was built for him. I said okay. I said it calmly. I was already thinking about the folder on my laptop. I called my mother the next morning. I did not tell her about the seating chart. I did not tell her about the email I had seen, or the calls Marcus took in the other room, or the 2 years of small erosions I had documented quietly in a folder called Notes. I did not tell her what I had been planning for the past 6 weeks. I told her I loved her. I told her she looked beautiful in the navy dress and she should wear it down. I told her I was so glad she was coming. She said, "Baby, are you okay?" I said, "I will be." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay," just like that. The way she always does, full trust, no conditions. I held the phone against my chest for a moment after we hung up. Then I opened my laptop. Here is what Diane did not know about me. She knew I worked in finance. She knew I had been promoted twice in 3 years. She knew I owned my apartment and drove a reliable car and had been to graduate school. This information she had filed away under acceptable, perhaps even under useful, the way you might categorize a piece of furniture that functions well enough even if it isn't exactly what you would have chosen. What she did not know was that 14 months ago, I became a silent partner in a private equity firm. What she did not know was that this firm had been quietly, methodically, acquiring debt held against several small and mid-sized companies in the Connecticut and New York corridor. What she did not know, because it was structured specifically to be unknown, was that one of those companies was Hargrove and Associates, the consulting firm her husband had built over 30 years and which Marcus was being positioned to inherit. I want to be very clear about the timeline. I did not make this investment because of Diane. I made it because it was a sound investment, because the numbers made sense, because a colleague I trusted brought me in, and the due diligence was clean. The fact that I later discovered the connection to the Hargrove family, approximately 4 months after the investment closed, was something I sat with for a long time. I spoke to my attorney. I spoke to my financial advisor. I reviewed every document. Everything I had done was entirely legal. Everything I had done was entirely mine. What I chose to do with the timing, that was a decision I made deliberately, with both eyes open. The dinner party was on a Saturday in October. The estate was everything you'd expect: stone driveway, manicured hedges, a house that announces itself before you've finished parking. The inside was warm and deliberately beautiful. Flowers I recognized as expensive, lighting adjusted to flatter, a bartender in a white jacket behind a table near the window. My mother arrived in the navy dress. hair down, pearl earrings I had given her 2 birthdays ago. She looked exactly like herself, which is to say she looked like someone who has nothing to prove and has never needed to prove it. Diane greeted her at the door with a smile that didn't reach her collarbone and directed her, without hesitation, toward the back of the room. I watched my mother follow the direction without comment. I watched and I breathed and I held everything still inside my chest. Dinner was served in courses. By the second course, Diane had made 2 comments. The first, directed at a family friend seated near her, concerned the refreshing simplicity of people who didn't get caught up in the pressures of a certain kind of lifestyle. The second, quieter, came as my mother was being introduced to Marcus's aunt, and it involved a reference to humble beginnings delivered with the warmth of a compliment and the precision of a blade. The table near her smiled. My mother smiled back. Marcus put his hand on my arm under the table. A warning, or a comfort. I was no longer certain which one he thought he was offering. I excused myself between the second and third courses. In the hallway near the kitchen, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, the second was to my partner at the firm. Both calls lasted under 4 minutes. When I came back to the table, the third course had arrived. I picked up my fork. I ate. Diane gave a speech after dessert. She stood at the head of the room with a champagne glass and spoke about family and legacy, and the importance of knowing where you come from. She spoke about the Hargrove name with the reverence people reserve for things they believe are permanent. She spoke about Marcus's future and the company he would one day lead, and she said, with a particular warmth directed at the room, "We are so glad to be welcoming new people into this family, people who understand what we've built." She did not look at my mother when she said it. The room applauded. I set down my champagne glass. I stood up. The room took a moment to notice. Then it went quiet in that particular way that means everyone has noticed at once. I said, "I'd like to say something, if that's all right." Diane's smile held, but her eyes changed. I said, "I want to thank you for this evening. I want to thank you for the flowers and the food and the care that went into all of this. I can see that it mattered to you." I paused. I said, "I also want to introduce my mother properly, since she wasn't introduced during the welcome. Her name is Gloria. She raised me alone. She worked 2 jobs for most of my life, so that I could go to school and build something. Everything I have, everything that apparently made me worth placing at this table came from her. So I'd like everyone here to know her name." The room was very still. I looked at Marcus. He was looking at me with an expression I had seen before, the one that meant, "You are making this very difficult for me." I held his gaze for a moment. Then I looked away. I looked at Diane. I said, "I also want to say something about legacy, since you raised the subject. Legacy isn't just a name on a building or a company in a portfolio. It's what you pass on to people who have no reason to trust you and still do. My mother gave me that. I want to make sure she is seen tonight." I raised my glass in my mother's direction. Several people at the table near her raised theirs. I sat down. The evening ended politely, the way certain kinds of disasters do. People gathered their jackets and said their goodbyes and thanked Diane for a beautiful evening and avoided making eye contact with anyone who seemed likely to require an opinion. Marcus didn't speak to me in the car. My mother squeezed my hand in the parking lot before she got into her own car. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I drove home. I changed into comfortable clothes. I opened my laptop. Monday morning, the firm sent formal notice to Hargrove and Associates. The debt we held was not insignificant. We were within our rights to call it, restructure it, or in certain circumstances, move toward acquisition proceedings. What we chose to do was open a conversation, a formal, documented, entirely professional conversation about the company's financial position and its obligations to its creditors. I was not involved directly. I was a silent partner. That was the structure. That was always the structure. But I was informed. I was kept current. And I had made clear, through my attorney and through proper channels, what my preferences were and were not. I received a call from Marcus on Monday afternoon. He said, "What did you do?" I said, "I don't know what you're referring to." He said, "The firm. Someone is calling in debt on the firm. My father is," and then he stopped and I could hear him breathing. I said, "Marcus, I'm sorry to hear that. That sounds really stressful." He said my name. Once. The way he used to say it at the beginning when it meant something different. I said, I think we both know this conversation is the end of something. I think we've known for a while. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it clearly. He said, "You planned this." I said, "I planned to protect myself. I planned to protect my mother. Whatever else happened, those were decisions made by people who had choices at every step." I hung up. I texted my mother that night. I said, "Dinner this week? My treat." She said, "Navy dress again or something new?" I said, "Wear whatever you want. You always look beautiful." She sent back a single heart. I set my phone down and looked at the ceiling for a while. There are people who will hear this story and say I went too far, that what I did was calculated, cold, disproportionate. I have thought about this. I have turned it over carefully, the way I turn over every decision I make, looking at every side. What I keep coming back to is my mother's face at that dinner table, the way she stirred her soup, the way she decided not to react, the way she has been deciding not to react, quietly and without complaint, her entire life, not because she is weak, but because she is generous in ways that people like Diane have never had to be. She was generous enough for both of us. I decided to stop asking her to be. The engagement is over. The ring is in a small box on my dresser. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. Hargrove and Associates is in restructuring. Marcus is working with an outside consultant to stabilize the company. I don't know the details and I don't need to. My mother and I had dinner last Thursday. She ordered the salmon and told me 3 stories about her coworkers and laughed until she had to put down her water glass. She looked the way she always looks, like someone who has survived everything quietly and arrived somewhere solid. At the end of the night, she took my hand across the table. She said, "You didn't have to do all of that for me, you know." I said, "I know." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "But thank you." I paid the check. We walked out together. The night was cold and clear and full of stars, and my mother linked her arm through mine the way she has since I was small, and we walked to the parking lot slowly, the way you walk when you are not in a hurry, when you have nowhere to be except exactly where you are. That is where the story ends. Not with a collapse, not with a verdict, not with anyone on their knees, just 2 women, walking to their cars, in the cold, under an ordinary sky. That was enough. That was always going to be enough.